John. The kitchen was dimly lit, casting deep shadows over the counters and cabinets. John stood at the stove, his face illuminated by the flickering flame. The scent of the ham wafted through the air, mingling with the smell of autumn leaves and pumpkin spice. John's mind wandered as he stirred, lost in memories of his childhood. He could almost hear his mother's voice, teaching him the secrets of her famous ham recipe. He had always loved Halloween, a time when the world seemed to slow down and the veil between the living and the dead grew thin. But this Halloween was different. There was a tension in the air, a feeling of unease that seemed to seep into every corner of his home. John couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. Odie the dog was sitting beside him, watching him with big, pleading eyes. John knew what he was thinking, could almost hear the little whines and yips that Odie made when he was hungry. John chuckled to himself, scratching Odie behind the ears. He loved that silly little dog more than anything in the world. As he stirred the ham, feelings of peace overcame him, and John's mind wandered back to Liz, as it often did. He had been obsessed with her for years, ever since he first laid eyes on her. He remembered the way her hair fell in soft curls around her face, the way her lips curved into a smile when she laughed. He had never met anyone like her, anyone who made his heart race and his palms sweat. He longed to be with her, to hold her close and tell her how he felt. But something always held him back, a fear of rejection that gnawed at his insides. He had tried to push those thoughts aside, to focus on other things, but they always crept back into his mind. He found himself imagining her in his bed, her soft skin against his, her lips pressed against his neck. He knew it was wrong to think of her that way, but he couldn't help it. The thought of her drove him wild with desire. He shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts. He couldn't let himself get carried away like this. He had to focus on the ham, on making sure it was perfect. But the image of Liz, lying next to him in bed, wouldn't leave his mind. He wondered if she felt the same way, if she ever thought of him in that way. He knew it was unlikely, knew that she probably saw him as just a friend, but he couldn't help but hope. He found himself glancing at his phone, wondering if she had texted him. He knew it was foolish, knew that she probably had better things to do than talk to him, but he couldn't help it. He needed to know that she was thinking of him, that he was on her mind. He felt a pang of jealousy, wondering if she was with someone else. He couldn't stand the thought of her being with anyone but him. He wanted to be the one to make her laugh, to hold her close, to make her feel alive. He realized that he had been staring off into space, lost in his own thoughts. He shook his head, trying to clear his mind. He couldn't let himself get distracted like this. He had to focus on the ham, on making sure it was perfect. But even as he stirred the pot, he couldn't help but think of her. The way her hair smelled, the way her eyes sparkled in the moonlight. He knew he had to tell her how he felt, had to take that risk. But the fear of rejection held him back, like a weight around his neck. He wondered if he would ever find the courage to tell her, to let her know how he really felt. He sighed, knowing that he would probably never find out. The sound of a car horn outside shattered his reverie, making him jump. John cursed under his breath, knowing it was probably just some trick-or-treaters. He had always hated Halloween pranks, especially when they interrupted his cooking. He hated when people didn't respect his privacy, especially when he was in the middle of cooking. He glanced out the window, his eyes scanning the crowded Halloween street. He saw a group of trick-or-treaters, dressed in ghoulish costumes and carrying bags of candy. He shook his head, muttering to himself. Odie the dog was sitting beside him, panting eagerly and wagging his tail. John could almost hear him saying, "Feed me! Feed me!" in his own doggy way. John chuckled to himself, scratching Odie behind the ears. He loved that silly little dog more than anything in the world. Suddenly the smell of the ham hit him, and John's mouth watered. It smelled so delicious he couldn't wait to dig in. But then he realized something was wrong. Something was missing. "Where's Garfield?" he asked, turning to Odie. Odie cocked his head to the side, a confused look on his face. John groaned. How could Garfield have disappeared at a time like this? They were about to enjoy the most delicious ham in the world, and Garfield was nowhere to be found. John's mind started racing with terrifying thoughts. Had Garfield been kidnapped by some deranged cat hater? Or worse, had he been hit by a car while chasing a mouse across the street? John shuddered at the thought of his beloved feline lying in a ditch somewhere, injured and alone. Suddenly he stopped in his tracks, his eyes widening with horror. What if Garfield had fallen into a witch's cauldron and been transformed into a toad? Or worse, what if he had been cursed by a gypsy and was now doomed to roam the earth as a spectral apparition? He paced around the kitchen, wringing his hands in despair. Odie followed him with concerned eyes, sensing his master's distress. John ranted about how unfair it was, how Halloween always brought out the worst in people. He railed against the world and its injustices, his voice growing louder and more desperate with each passing moment. "Come on, Odie," John said, grabbing his coat. "We've got to find him." John's door flew upon, and the two delved into the night. John's mind was ablaze with a single, all-consuming thought: to save his beloved cat from the forces of darkness and bring him back home where he belonged. The two of them raced out into the crowded Halloween street, which was filled with trick-or-treaters and spooky decorations. John's heart raced as he scanned the crowd, hoping to catch a glimpse of his orange, lasagna-loving cat. "Garfield!" he called out, but the noise of the crowd drowned out his voice. He couldn't see Garfield anywhere. As they ran through the street, John's mind raced. Where could Garfield be? Had he run away? Had someone taken him? The thought of losing his beloved cat was almost too much to bear. But then, just as John was about to give up hope, he spotted something orange and furry in the distance. John's heart leaped with hope. Could it be Garfield? He sprinted towards it, his mind racing with 1,000 different scenarios. What if it was a trap, a decoy meant to lure him into a false sense of security? He had to be careful. He had to stay alert. But as he drew closer, his hopes were dashed. It was just a child in a tiger costume, innocently walking down the street with a bag of candy. John's mind snapped. All the fear, anxiety, and paranoia he had been feeling suddenly boiled over into a white-hot rage. John's rage was a molten lava, simmering just beneath the surface, waiting to erupt with the slightest provocation. It was a raging inferno, consuming everything in its path, leaving only destruction and chaos in its wake. The mere thought of Garfield being in danger was enough to ignite the flames of his fury, and they burned hotter with each passing moment. His heart pounded in his chest, and his hands shook with a wild energy that he could barely contain. He imagined the worst possible scenarios, each one more horrifying than the last, and each one drove him further and further into madness. He saw Garfield being attacked by vicious dogs, or being tortured by a sadistic cat hater, or being trapped in a burning building, unable to escape. All of these images swirled together in his mind, a whirlpool of fear and anger and despair, until he could no longer distinguish one from the other. He was lost in a sea of raw emotion. Without a second thought, he lunged at the child, grabbing him by the collar and shaking him violently. "Where is he?" he screamed, his eyes bulging with fury. "Where have you hidden Garfield, you little fucker?" The little boy was terrified, his eyes wide with shock and fear. He had never seen such raw anger before, such unbridled fury. He felt completely helpless, completely at the mercy of this madman. He could feel John's hot breath on his skin, could feel the strength of his grip on his collar. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. He had no idea what was going on, or why this crazy man was attacking him, but John didn't care. All he could see was a tiger, a symbol of everything that had gone wrong on this cursed Halloween night. John's grip tightened, and the little boy whimpered in pain. He could feel his collar digging into his skin, cutting off his air supply. He was sure he was going to die, right there on the street, at the hands of this lunatic. He shook the child again, harder this time, his grip like iron. "Tell me where he is!" he shouted, spittle flying from his lips. "Tell me or I'll make you regret it!" The child cried out, begging for mercy, but John was beyond reason. He slammed the child against the side of a parked car. Snap! The sound of the boy's neck breaking under John's grip brought silence to the night. His fists clenched with rage. John felt good about what he did. He felt as if he were closer to Garfield now more than he had ever been. A small pool of blood began to form around the boy in the tiger costume. Somehow in the commotion, no one noticed. Everyone was so busy in their day-to-day lives enjoying themselves that they never even noticed such a violent and depraved man commit such an atrocity. Odie followed close behind, his tail between his legs, sensing his master's anger and desperation. As he neared the end of the street, John saw a familiar house in the distance. It was Liz's house, the object of his unrequited love. His heart leapt with hope as he hurried towards it, ignoring the curious glances from the neighbors. Maybe, just maybe, Garfield was there. Maybe Liz had seen him wandering around and taken him in. John quickened his pace. Faster and faster he ran, shoved and pushed through the crowd, a renewed sense of purpose driving him forward. As John approached the porch of Liz's house, he saw Garfield lounging on a chair, munching on a watermelon slice. Liz was sitting next to him, giggling at his silly antics. John's heart swelled with relief and joy as he realized that Garfield was safe and sound. He stumbled up the steps, breathing heavily from his frantic search. Garfield looked up at him, his eyes widening in surprise and confusion. Liz's smile faded as she took in John's disheveled appearance and wild eyes. "John, what's wrong?" she asked, concern etched on her face. John could barely speak, his words coming out in a jumbled mess. "Garfield, I thought he was gone. I looked everywhere. I was so scared," he managed to say between gasps for air. Garfield let out a loud burp, drawing everyone's attention. "Excuse me," he said, licking his lips. "I just had a watermelon. The seedless kind is the cat's meow, you know." Liz's expression softened, and she put a comforting hand on John's shoulder. "He's okay, John. He's right here," she said, gesturing towards Garfield. John let out a shaky breath, feeling the weight of his fear and anxiety lifting off his shoulders. He walked over to Garfield and knelt down, wrapping his arms around him in a tight embrace. Garfield purred contentedly, nuzzling his head against John's chest. For a few moments, all was right in the world. John was reunited with his beloved cat, and he was surrounded by the warmth and kindness of Liz. He knew that he was lucky to have such wonderful friends in his life. Nothing lasts forever. An unknown man stepped out of the home and interrupted their reunion. "John, I want you to meet Stephen, my boyfriend." John's heart sank. He could feel the anger rising in him once again, bubbling up like a volcano ready to explode. "Who's this bozo?" the boyfriend asked, eyeing John up and down with disdain. John's vision blurred with red as he gritted his teeth, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. How dare this man ruin his moment with Liz and Garfield? How dare he call him a bozo? He took a step forward, his eyes locked on the boyfriend's smug face. "Who am I? Who am I?" John repeated, his voice growing louder with each word. "I'm the man who loves Liz. I'm the man who cares about Garfield more than anything in this world. And you're just some clown who's standing in my way." John lunged forward, ready to take down this obstacle in his path. His rage fueled his movements, making him faster and stronger than he ever thought possible. The boyfriend stumbled back in surprise, no match for John's raw power. But even as he savagely attacked the boyfriend, a small voice in the back of his mind told him that this was wrong, that he was losing control once again, letting his anger consume him. But he couldn't stop himself. He was a man possessed, driven by his love for Liz and his desperation to find Garfield. When the dust settled and John came back to his senses, he looked down at the unconscious body of Liz's boyfriend, his fists still clenched and trembling with rage. He knew he had gone too far once again, and that there was no going back. He had destroyed any chance of being with Liz and had hurt an innocent person in the process. He hung his head in shame, knowing that he was no better than the monster he had become. John's mind raced with paranoid thoughts as he walked away from the scene of the fight. He was afraid of what Liz would think of him now, of what everyone in the neighborhood would say about him. He couldn't bear the thought of losing her, of losing the one thing that had given his life meaning. His thoughts spiraled out of control, and he began to imagine all sorts of scenarios where Liz was taken away from him. He saw her in the arms of another man, laughing and happy, while he was left alone and forgotten. He saw himself becoming more and more isolated, a prisoner of his own anger and jealousy. The more he thought about it, the more convinced he became that he needed to have Liz, no matter what the cost. He couldn't bear the thought of someone else being with her, of someone else making her happy. He had to win her back, no matter what it took. As he walked down the dark streets, John's mind became consumed with thoughts of Liz and the overwhelming desire to possess her. He was a man possessed, and there was no stopping him. Hours later, John sat hunched over his map of Liz's house, his eyes darting back and forth as he tried to come up with the perfect plan to win her heart. Garfield sat next to him, wearing a general's helmet that John had found in a costume shop earlier that day. Odie was curled up at their feet, his tail thumping against the concrete floor. "We need to make a grand gesture," John said, tapping his finger against the map. "Something that will show her how much I care." Garfield nodded, and John assumed it was agreement. "Maybe we could write a love letter," he continued. "Or I could serenade her outside her window." Odie barked, and John looked at him quizzically. "What's that, boy?" he asked. John said, pondering, "We need to do something big, something grand, like a flash mob." Garfield tilted his head, pretending to consider. A flash mob?" John's face lit up. "Yes, that's it. A flash mob. That's a great idea, Garfield," he said, unaware that Garfield was being sarcastic. Odie barked in agreement, and Garfield rolled his eyes. "Sure, a flash mob. Because nothing screams I love you like a group of strangers dancing outside your house," he muttered under his breath. John didn't hear him, too excited about the plan. "We'll make it really special. We'll get costumes and lasers. It'll be perfect," he said, already scribbling down notes. Garfield just smirked, knowing that this plan was going to be a disaster. But he couldn't help but admire John's enthusiasm and determination to win Liz's heart. John felt a surge of excitement. This was it. This was the plan that would win Liz over. He began to jot down ideas and notes, his hands shaking with anticipation. John's mind was racing with ideas and plans, his heart pounding with anticipation. This was his chance to win Liz over, to show her that he was the one she truly belonged with. His hands were shaking as he scribbled down notes and ideas, his mind consumed with thoughts of her. He couldn't stop thinking about her, day and night, every waking moment consumed by thoughts of her smile, her laugh, her touch. He had to have her, had to make her see that he was the only one who could truly love and care for her. As he wrote down his ideas for the flash mob, he felt a surge of excitement building inside him. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. With Garfield and Odie by his side, he felt invincible, ready to take on the world and win the heart of the one he loved. As he worked, Odie nuzzled his leg, and John looked down at him fondly. "Thanks for your help, boy," he said, scratching him behind the ears. He knew it wouldn't be easy, knew that he would have to pour every ounce of his being into this plan, but he was willing to do whatever it took. He couldn't imagine a life without Liz, and he would stop at nothing to make her his. As he finished jotting down his notes, he looked up at Garfield and Odie, his eyes burning with determination. "We're going to make this happen," he said, his voice filled with conviction. John, Odie, and Garfield took their positions outside Liz's house, their laser pointers at the ready, and their Bluetooth speaker blasting their chosen love song, More Than a Woman. John had put on his ripped jeans and bad makeup, and he was feeling confident that this was the perfect way to win Liz's heart. John had tried his best to make himself look cool and edgy, but the result was far from it. The jeans he had chosen were so ripped that they were barely holding together, and his makeup was smeared and poorly applied, making him look more like a clown than a romantic lead. Garfield and Odie had also done their best to dress up as well, but their efforts fell short. Garfield had donned a makeshift captain's hat, but it was slightly crooked and looked like it had been made out of a paper plate. Odie was wearing a homemade bow tie that was clearly too small for him, and it kept slipping down around his neck. As they started their routine, John's movements were awkward and uncoordinated, but he was completely oblivious to it. He thought he was a dancing machine, a master of the flash mob. Garfield and Odie tried their best to keep up, but they could barely contain their laughter. John's confidence only grew. He waved his laser pointer around wildly, pointing it at imaginary crowds of adoring fans. Passers-by on the street stopped to stare at the ridiculous display, but John didn't care. All that mattered was that Liz was watching from behind her closed door, and he was sure that she would be so impressed with his moves that she would have to come out and join in. But as they finished their routine, the lights in Liz's house remained off, and the door remained closed. John was undeterred, though. He was sure that she was just playing hard to get, and he was determined to win her over. It wasn't until the song ended that they finished the routine and started walking towards the house that John noticed the one light on the right side of the home. He was so caught up in his own world that he hadn't even noticed it before. But even then, he was sure that Liz was just waiting for him inside, ready to accept his love. It wasn't until he reached the door and knocked that he realized how much of a failure his flash mob had been. The house remained cold and dark, as still as the night, a void reflecting John's emptiness, and it became clear to him that his grand romantic gesture had fallen flat. Garfield and Odie exchanged concerned glances, but John was still lost in his own delusions. He couldn't see how ridiculous he looked, or how his obsession with Liz had blinded him to reality. John's heart pounded in his chest as he crept closer to Liz's house, his eyes darting around for any sign of her. He finally spotted her through the window, and his heart sank as he saw her making love to Stephen on the bed. His echoing grunts pierced her soft moans as the two passionately gyrated in a tender synchronicity. The sight was like a physical blow to his chest, and he stumbled backwards. He lost all balance. It was as if hope had been pulled from his body, and nothing was left to remain. He fell to the ground, his hands clutching at his chest as he struggled to breathe. Everything around him seemed to be spinning out of control, and he felt as though he were drowning in a sea of emotions. He couldn't bear the thought of Liz with someone else, and the pain of it all was overwhelming. He lay there, gasping for air, his mind racing with thoughts of what he had lost. The world seemed like a cruel, unfair place, and he felt powerless to change anything. As he lay there, his mind consumed by despair, he couldn't help but wonder how things had gone so wrong. He had poured so much of himself into winning Liz's heart, and now it all seemed for nothing. The pain of it all was too much to bear, and he felt himself slipping away. Eventually, he lost consciousness, the weight of his emotions too much for him to bear. As he drifted off into darkness, he knew that things would never be the same again. John slowly opened his eyes and found himself staring up at the ceiling. His head was pounding and he felt disoriented and confused. Suddenly, he felt a sharp sting on his cheek, and he jolted upright to see Garfield's paw raised, ready to strike him again. Being Garfield, he struck John 3 more times after seeing that John had awoken. "Wake up, John! Snap out of it!" Garfield hissed, his eyes narrowed with concern. Odie barked frantically, and John could feel the wetness of his tongue as he licked his face. John tried to speak, but his voice came out as a hoarse whisper. "What happened, Garfield?" he managed to croak out. Garfield sighed heavily, dropping John's head to the ground. "Honestly, I thought you passed out because you caught a glimpse of your own reflection. That makeup was not doing you any favors." John winced at the reminder of his failure, feeling a sense of shame wash over him. He looked down at his hands, noticing that they were trembling slightly. "I saw her," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "Saw who?" Garfield asked, his tone softening slightly. "Stephen and Liz. Through the window," John whispered, his eyes brimming with tears. Garfield's expression softened, and he placed a paw on John's shoulder. "Oh, buddy, I'm sorry." His face twisted in anger and hurt, and he pushed them both away. Garfield and Odie tried to calm John down, but he was beyond reason. "I can't believe it," he growled. "All this time I thought she was waiting for me, but she was with him all along. How could she do this to me? She fucking left me for him." Garfield and Odie exchanged worried glances, unsure of how to handle their friend's outburst. John had never been so belligerent before, and they knew they needed to tread carefully. "John, please calm down," Garfield said, trying to reason with him. "Lashing out won't solve anything." But John wasn't listening. He was consumed by his anger and pain. Tears flowing from his eyes, he continued to rant and rave about how he had been betrayed. Garfield and Odie tried their best to soothe him, but it was no use. John was inconsolable, lost in a world of hurt and confusion. Odie whined softly, sensing the tension in the air. Garfield's tail twitched as he backed away slightly. Okay, calm down, you errant yourself, John. Please, what's wrong?" John's expression darkened. Garfield could see an evil wash over John's face. He was horrified of what he had become. Garfield reasoned that the fight was John lashing out, but he could tell what John was about to do was something new, a poison within him. "I'm going over there to give Stephen a piece of my mind." Garfield raised an eyebrow. "Yeah, because violence is always the answer," he said sarcastically. But John wasn't listening. He was already storming towards Liz's house, his anger fueling him. Garfield and Odie exchanged a worried look before following after him, hoping to calm him down before he did something he would regret. "I'm not stopping, not anymore." With his sheer strength, John kicked in the door and disappeared into the dark home. Garfield and Odie sat anxiously at the front door, waiting for John to emerge from the house. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional sound of crickets in the distance. Suddenly, 2 bullets rang out echoing through the house, causing both Garfield and Odie to jump in fear. They exchanged worried glances, unsure of what John could have done. Garfield's ears twitched as he strained to hear any further sounds from inside the house. But there was nothing. "Should we go in and check on him?" Odie barked out in his unintelligible demeanor, his eyes wide with concern. Garfield shook his head. "No, let's wait a little longer. John can be a bit unpredictable sometimes. We don't want to startle him." Garfield and Odie sat outside for what seemed like an eternity. The moon had risen high in the sky, casting a pale glow over the neighborhood. The two friends were too afraid to move, too afraid to break the silence and disturb whatever was happening inside the house. As they waited, their minds raced with thoughts of what could have caused the noises they had heard. Was John okay? Had something terrible happened to him? They couldn't bear to think about it, but they couldn't stop their minds from wandering to the worst-case scenario. Garfield fidgeted nervously, his claws scratching against the wooden porch. Odie whimpered softly, his eyes fixed on the front door. They both knew that they should do something, but they were frozen with fear. As they sat there in silence, Odie suddenly spoke up, speaking in roughs and unintelligible dog noises, but Garfield, being Garfield, can understand him clear as day. "Garfield, I need to tell you something. Something I saw earlier today." Garfield turned to look at Odie, curious. "What is it?" Odie whimpered. "I saw John attack a child before we found you at Liz's house," Odie said, his voice trembling. "He just snapped and went after him. I don't know what's wrong with him, but he's not the same as he used to be." "What? Are you sure?" Odie nodded. "I saw it with my own eyes. He's been acting strange for a while now, and I think he's going insane." Garfield shook his head, trying to process this new information. "That can't be right. John is our friend. He wouldn't do something like that." "But he did," Odie insisted. "And now he's in that house, and we don't know what he's capable of. We need to do something." Garfield sighed heavily, his mind racing with thoughts. He didn't know what to do, but he knew they couldn't just sit there and wait any longer. They needed to take action. "Okay," he said finally. "Let's go inside and see if we can find him. But be careful, Odie. We don't know what we're getting into." He stood up, his muscles tense and ready for action. Odie hesitated for a moment, but then followed suit. Together they approached the front door, their hearts in their throats. Garfield reached out a paw and hesitated for just a moment before knocking on the door. They waited for what felt like an eternity, but there was no answer. Garfield knocked again, louder this time. "John, it's us, Garfield and Odie. Are you okay?" There was no response. Garfield exchanged a worried glance with Odie, and then tried the doorknob. To his surprise, it was unlocked. He pushed the door open slowly, his senses on high alert. The inside of the house was dark and quiet, with no sign of John anywhere. Garfield and Odie crept inside, their eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of their friend. "John?" Garfield called out, his voice echoing through the empty house. The home stood silent, unmoving. They stopped in their tracks. Garfield and Odie's ears perked up as they heard the distant wail of police sirens. They exchanged a worried glance, wondering what could have happened to cause such a commotion. As the sirens grew louder, Garfield and Odie couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. Maybe the police could help John, or at least figure out what was going on. Several squad cars screeched to a halt in front of the house, their headlights illuminating the dark street. Officers burst out of the cars, their guns drawn as they approached the house. Garfield and Odie watched from a safe distance as the police stormed the house, their voices muffled by the closed door. The tension in the air was thick, and both Garfield and Odie held their breath, hoping for the best, but fearing the worst. They waited a moment. Garfield's eyes widened in shock. "What? Are you sure?" Odie nodded. "I saw it with my own eyes. He's been acting strange for a while now, and I think he's going insane." Garfield shook his head, trying to process this new information. "That can't be right. John is our friend. He wouldn't do something like that." "But he did," Odie insisted. "And now he's in that house, and we don't know what he's capable of. We need to do something." Garfield sighed heavily, his mind racing with thoughts. He didn't know what to do, but he knew they couldn't just sit there and wait any longer. They needed to take action. "Okay," he said finally. "Let's go inside and see if we can find him. But be careful, Odie. We don't know what we're getting into." He stood up, his muscles tense and ready for action. Odie hesitated for a moment, but then followed suit. Together they approached the front door, their hearts in their throats. Garfield reached out a paw and hesitated for just a moment before knocking on the door. They waited for what felt like an eternity, but there was no answer. Garfield knocked again, louder this time. "John, it's us. Garfield and Odie. Are you okay?" There was no response. Garfield exchanged a worried glance with Odie, his senses on high alert. The inside of the house was dark and quiet, with no sign of John anywhere. Garfield and Odie crept inside, their eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of their friend. "John," Garfield called out, his voice echoing through the empty house. The home stood silent, unmoving. They stopped in their tracks. Garfield and Odie's ears perked up as they heard the distant wail of police sirens. They exchanged a worried glance, wondering what could have happened to cause such a commotion. As the sirens grew louder, Garfield and Odie couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. Maybe the police could help John, or at least figure out what was going on. Several squad cars screeched to a halt in front of the house, their headlights illuminating the dark street. Officers burst out of the cars, their guns drawn as they approached the house. Garfield and Odie watched from a safe distance as the police stormed the house, their voices muffled by the closed door. The tension in the air was thick, and both Garfield and Odie held their breath, hoping for the best, but fearing the worst. They waited a moment. They could hear the police officers barking orders at John to get down and lay on the ground. Garfield and Odie followed an officer inside, their hearts heavy with dread. They couldn't help but wonder what had happened inside that house, and what it would mean for John's future. Garfield and Odie watched in shock as John was handcuffed on the ground and surrounded by police. His face was covered in crimson blood that made their stomachs turn. They tried to follow the officer into the kitchen, but a police officer stopped them, his hand held up in warning. "You two can't come in here," the officer said firmly. They were left in shock, awe-stricken as to what had happened. Garfield and Odie were left standing outside the kitchen, feeling helpless and afraid. They had never seen John like this before. What did he do to Liz? And why was he covered in blood? As they stood there, police sirens blared in the distance, getting louder and louder until several other squad cars arrived and stormed into the house. The commotion was overwhelming, and Garfield and Odie could barely understand what was happening in the moment. Suddenly, an officer came out of Liz's room, stumbling backwards and vomiting. Garfield and Odie were horrified by what they saw and could only imagine the worst. They were left in shock. Before they knew it, they were escorted behind the police barricade, forced to wait as the officers continued their investigation. Garfield and Odie huddled together, fear gripping their hearts. They didn't know what was going on, but they weren't stupid. Well, Garfield wasn't. They knew that it was something terrible. Odie and Garfield stood silently on the other side of the police barricade, watching as John was escorted out of the house in handcuffs. The press had arrived, their cameras flashing wildly as they shouted questions at the police officers. Garfield's ears flattened against his head, and he hissed in annoyance at the intrusion. Odie whimpered softly, his tail between his legs, as the chaos unfolded before them. As John was led away, the press followed closely behind, shouting questions and snapping photos. Garfield and Odie watched in silence, feeling a mix of fear and sadness for their former owner. As the police car drove away with John, the reporters began to disperse, but some remained behind, still snapping photos and shouting questions. Garfield growled, his patience wearing thin.
On this Halloween night, tragedy has struck our community. 2 individuals, identified as Liz Wilson and Stephen DeClercq, have been found brutally murdered in their home. The suspect has been identified as John Arbuckle, a resident of the same neighborhood.
Garfield's eyes widened as he heard John's name mentioned. He couldn't believe what he was hearing.
The police have apprehended Mr. Arbuckle, and he is currently being held at the local Supermax penitentiary for the criminally insane,
the anchorwoman continued.
We urge all residents to remain vigilant and report any suspicious activity to the authorities.
As the news report ended, Garfield and Odie sat in stunned silence. They couldn't believe that their friend and owner could be capable of such a heinous act. The weight of the situation hung heavily in the air as they tried to process what had happened. They sat in silence,